It's Memorial Day weekend. Thank you for being here, man. We're excited about everything God's going to do this morning. We're starting a brand new series called Pivot Point. Everyone say pivot. You know, a pivot is something that we do all day, every day. We're constantly pivoting. You know, if you're walking somewhere and someone calls your name, what do? You pivot to see who's calling you. If you walk out of the house in the morning but forget your cell phone, you pivot to go back in and get it. If you're at the grocery store and you see somebody you don't want to talk to, you ever been there? You pivot to go the other direction. It's going to happen to me next week for all those people that don't show up on Memorial Day weekend and they see me at the grocery store. They're about to pivot when they see me. Pastor life, right? And so we all understand that pivoting is something that happens all the time, but there's power in a pivot. When we pivot, there's power in that moment. You know, growing up, I loved sitting on the seesaw, on the seesaw, the teeter-totter. And so you'd get a friend that was about your size, and you'd get on the teeter-totter, and one would push up, and one would push down, and there was this pivot moment. Or there's pivots all over the place. I think if you like sports, athletes are successful because of the power of the pivot. The reason that they can juke in football or in basketball is because they're able to pivot. The reason someone can drive a golf ball far is because of the power of the pivot. The reason a boxer or an MMA fighter is able to knock someone out is because of the power of the pivot. You know, my great-grandpa growing up, he used to tell me, Trustin, when you get into a fight, not if you get into a fight, right? I grew up in Flint, Michigan. When you get into a fight, he said, don't punch someone with your arm, punch them with the pivot. The power comes from your hips and your shoulders. There's power in the pivot. And that's true in a lot of aspects in life, that when we'll be intentional about the pivot moments in life, there can be power in those seasons. But a pivot always has a fulcrum. On the teeter-totter, where the board is mounted, there's a fulcrum point, and there's always pressure in the moment of the pivot. And so if you walk in this morning, there's an area of your life where there's some pressure. Maybe it's time to pivot. Maybe it's time to say, you know what, it's time for me to make a change. It's time for me to make a shift. It's time for me to chase after something that God has for me. And so through this series, we're going to be looking at some pivot moments. We're going to be looking at different times that people interacted with Jesus. Jesus was the fulcrum point in their life that allowed them to have a pivot moment and change the direction, have something powerful happen. So don't miss a week. I know that we're in the summer, but as we're walking through these stories of Jesus, they're going to change your life. Today, the pivot point that we're talking about is Peter's pivot. Everyone say Peter. Peter's one of my favorite guys in the New Testament. I love him. He's all heart. He's all courage. He many times puts his mouth in motion before his mind is engaged, right? And so he gets himself in trouble every once in a while. He is the guy that jumps into action while everybody else is standing around and thinking about what to do. He's the guy who swung wildly and cut the ear off a Roman centurion to protect Jesus. He's the guy that didn't just stay in the boat, but said, Jesus, I'll follow you. And because of that, this normal guy walked on the water. That's who Peter is. And so I connect with Peter, and I think a lot of us connect with Peter because he's just a normal guy that God used. There was one time at the Last Supper that Jesus asked all of his disciples, who do you say that I am? And you know how when someone asks a question, you get kind of nervous and you're like, I'm not answering this question. Well, Peter has all courage and all faith, and he says, Jesus, you're the Son of God. You're the Messiah. He speaks up, and he has some courage in this moment. He's just a normal guy. But in the same conversation, at the meal at the Last Supper, Jesus says, you're right, I am the Son of God. And then he calls out Judas. Judas is another disciple of Jesus who's going to betray Jesus. Judas has a side plan going on with the Pharisees and the Romans that he's going to betray Jesus with a kiss and turn him over into captivity. And so Jesus calls him out and says, Judas, you're going to betray me. Judas gets mad and storms out of the room. And then after that, at the Last Supper, Jesus says something, and you can see some of Peter's personality come out. It says this in Matthew 26. Jesus told them, tonight, all of you will desert me. They're all so mad at what Judas has just did, but Jesus said, wait, don't get it twisted. He's deserting me, but all of you are going to desert me tonight. Peter declared, even if everyone else deserts you, I will never desert you, Lord. You hear his excitement? Jesus replied, I tell you the truth, Peter, this very night, even before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times that you even knew me. No, Peter insisted. Even if I have to die, you hear his passion? Even if I have to die, he's kind of over-exaggerating. Even if I have to die with you, I will never deny you. And so the Last Supper continues, and Jesus and all the disciples, they get up and they leave, and they walk from the upper city into the Garden of Gethsemane. We talked about this a couple weeks ago, that in the walk is when they passed through the vineyards, and Jesus says, I am the true vine. But they get to the Garden of Gethsemane, and while they're there, Jesus knows what's coming. He knows that Judas is about to betray him, and that the Roman guard is going to come and arrest him. And so Jesus is praying, and he's saying, God, if there's any other way, I'll do it, but your will be done. And while Jesus is praying, all the disciples, including Peter, fall asleep. So they're snoozing, they're asleep. Judas shows up with the Roman guard to arrest Jesus, and Peter wakes up from a slumber, and look at what he does. Just totally asleep. You know how when you just wake up in the morning, you get a phone call, and you try to pretend like you weren't sleeping? You're like, hello? No, I wasn't asleep. Maybe I'm the only person that does that. And so it says this. Peter wakes up, then Peter drew a sword and slashed off the right ear of Malchus, the high priest's slave. So Peter, he wakes up, and in a sleepy stumble, he just swings his sword at the first guy. He's trying to decapitate the dude, but his aim is so bad, nobody tries to chop off an ear. What good is, you're trying to kill the guy, right? And so it says this, but Jesus says to Peter, put your sword back in its sheath. Peter, relax, take a chill pill. Jesus walks over, picks up the guy's ear off the ground, sticks it back on his head, and heals him. So the Romans then take Jesus into captivity. Jesus is now taken away, and the disciples are freaking out. The disciples are freaking out because they know what's happening. Jesus has now been betrayed. He's been arrested. He's being questioned. And eventually he starts being beaten, which is leading to the crucifixion. And so we pick up the story in John 18. It says this, Peter followed Jesus, as did another one of the disciples. The other disciple was acquainted with the high priest, so he was allowed to enter the high priest's courtyard with Jesus, but Peter had to stay outside the gate. So many people believe this other disciple is Simon the Zealot because he had some connections. He had a homeboy hookup, right? He had someone who had access in this courtyard, so they let Simon in. So Simon goes in, but Peter gets denied access. He's not allowed into the courtyard. Look what happens. It says, then the disciple who knew the high priest spoke to the woman watching the gate and said, let Peter in. So Simon goes, he gets in the courtyard, then he walks back to the bouncer at the gate, and he goes, yo, this is Peter. This is my homeboy. He's with me. It's all good. Let him sneak into the courtyard, okay? And so now we see the interaction. It was a woman bouncer. It says, the woman asked Peter, you're not one of that man's disciples, are you? Jesus is in the courtyard, yes? You're one of that man's disciples. No, he says, I'm not. Goes on and says, because it was cold, the household servant and the guard had made a charcoal fire. They stood around it warming themselves, and Peter stood with them warming himself. Matthew goes on and adds to this story. He says this in Matthew 26. Meanwhile, so he starts over. Meanwhile, Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard, and a servant girl came over to him and said, you were one of those that was with Jesus of Galilee. But Peter denied it in front of everyone. I don't know what you're talking about, he said. Later, out by the gate, so here's the lady at the gate who's about to let him in. Later at the gate, another servant girl noticed him and said to those standing around, this man was with Jesus of Nazareth. Again, Peter denied it. This time with an oath. I don't even know the man, he said. A little later, some of the bystanders, what are they bystanders to? They're bystanders to the trial and the beating of Jesus. So Peter is now in the courtyard with Jesus, tied to a post, being accused of crimes that he did not commit. And all these people are standing around watching this to happen, and people turn to Peter and they say this. A little later, some of the bystanders came over to Peter and said, you must be one of them. We can tell by your Galilean accent. Peter swore, a curse on me if I'm lying. I don't know the man. And he points at Jesus, and for the third time he says, I don't know him. I deny him. I renounce him. I'm not in relationship with him. And it's very clear where he is. He's in the courtyard. It's very clear that Jesus is in there. And I believe that in this moment that Jesus locked eyes with Peter, and Peter saw the sadness on Jesus' face. Because Jesus is being denied by one of his close followers. This is Peter who was called to put down his nets and be a fisher of men. This is Peter who walked on the water. This is Peter who saw the miraculous happen. This is Peter who saw Lazarus come out of the tomb. This is Peter who ate the bread and the fish that Jesus multiplied from the little boy's lunch. This is Peter. But in this moment, he denies Jesus. I don't even know the man. And it goes on. He says, I don't even know the man. And immediately, the rooster crowed. Immediately, Jesus had prophesied earlier that Peter was going to deny him 3 times before the Easter crowed. I don't even know the man. And the rooster crowed. In this moment, Jesus is being abandoned by his friends. He's being accused by his enemy. He's left all alone. Verse 75 says this, suddenly, Jesus' words flashed through Peter's mind. He has a recall. He remembers Jesus saying, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times that you even know me. And he went away weeping bitterly. He's in the courtyard. He's made it in. He's watching the beating of Jesus. He accuses him. He looks at Jesus, and he realizes what he's done, and he starts to weep bitterly. He's brokenhearted. He's sobbing. He's crying. He's disappointed in himself. He's angry. He knows that he's screwed up. Have you ever been there? I know that I have. I've seen God do the miraculous in my life. I've seen God answer my prayers. I've known that he loved me, but then I get in a moment of temptation and I deny who he is in my life. And I walk away bitterly. I walk away feeling shame and feeling condemned and feeling like I'm not good enough. And after this moment, Peter, he has a downward spiral in life. He begins to pull away from relationship of the other disciples. He's full of shame. He feels that he's guilty. And so Jesus is found guilty for crimes that he didn't commit. He's beaten, he's crucified, he's buried, and then we know that 3 days later, hallelujah, he rose from the dead, right? So Jesus did not stay dead. He overcame death, hell, and the grave. So Jesus comes back to life. And then after Jesus is back to life, one of his followers, a lady named Mary, goes to visit the tomb of Jesus. When she gets there, Jesus is gone. But God sends an angel to talk to Mary to deliver a message. And it says this in Mark 16. The angel said, don't be alarmed, Mary. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth who is crucified, but he isn't here. He's risen from the dead. I'll preach that on Easter Sunday, right? Look, this is where they laid his body. Here's the instructions. Now go and tell his disciples and Peter that Jesus is going ahead of you to Galilee. You will see him there just as he told you before he died. Now, Peter was a disciple, yes? So the statement, tell the disciples, would have been a sufficient concept for the angel to tell Mary. But Mary is told specifically by the angel, the disciples and Peter. You see, the reason the and Peter is there is because God understood where Peter was. He knew the heartbreak he had. He knew that he had denied Jesus and that he felt shame and like he wasn't good enough. And no matter what's happened in your life, can I tell you something? That God not only wants to call you back into relationship, but he'll call you by name. That he'll add a little bit extra in the message just for you, just so that you know that he's speaking to you. And he'll allow these things to happen in life and in timing and in situations and through affirmation of others to let you know, hey son, hey daughter, I'm watching. I'm here with you. And so that's what Jesus does in this moment. And so the angel tells Mary to tell the disciples and Peter to go to Galilee. So we fast forward to Galilee. The story picks up in John 21. John gives us a little intro. It says, Jesus appeared. This is after the resurrection. Jesus appeared again to the disciples beside the Sea of Galilee. This is how it happened. So John's like, I'm about to tell you the second half of the story. Verse 2, several of the disciples were there at the Sea of Galilee. Peter showed up, Thomas, Nathanael, James, John, and 2 other disciples. So they're all hanging out per the advice of Mary. Look at what Peter says. Peter says, I'm going fishing. Anybody like to go fishing? Hello. Peter says, I'm going fishing. But see, when Peter says he's going fishing, it's a lot different than when we say we're going fishing. When we say we're going fishing, it means that we're going to go out and have a nice, relaxing afternoon, and we're going to participate in a sport that we have some enjoyment in. But Peter was a commercial fisherman. This was his profession previous to meeting Jesus. So when Peter says, I'm going fishing, what he's really saying is, I'm returning to the old lifestyle that I used to have that Jesus called me out of. And isn't that what we do when we mess up? We mess up, we feel like we've dishonored God, we feel like we've screwed up so bad that instead of trying to restore the relationship, we say, I'm going back to who I used to be. I'm going back to the things that used to provide for me. This person used to provide for me, so I'm going to go back to them relationally instead of God. This thing used to meet my needs in a temporary way, so I'm going to run back to this thing that temporarily made me feel good instead of get rid of my shame and run back to Jesus. See, Peter thinks that he's disqualified himself from being a fisher of men, so he's going to distract himself by fishing for fish. And this is what we do. This is what we do. We distract ourselves from focusing on what God has called us to be by just filling our life with busyness. And we think instead of dealing with the problem, instead of dealing with what's actually happening in the moment that we denied Christ, we just fill ourselves with busyness. And we just slip back into what we used to be and forget that God called us. And just like Peter, God has more for you. He had more for Peter than to be a fisherman. He wanted him to be a fisher of men. Now, I'm not telling you to quit your job. Don't quit your job. But I'm saying that God has more for you than where you are right now. That God wants to use you to do great things in this world. That he wants to use you to influence other people. That he wants to have a closer relationship with you than something broken and estranged. That he has more. Verse 3, it says this. Peter says, I'm going fishing. The disciples, they say, we'll come too, they all said. So they went out in the boat. Notice that even though Peter is in broken relationship with God, he's still a leader. He still has influence other people around him. And sometimes we have a broken relationship with God and we lead those that are following us in the wrong direction instead of the right direction. Because somebody's watching everybody. Mom and dad, your kids are watching you. People in your family are watching you. People at your job are watching you, and they know you go to church, and they know that you profess to be in a relationship with Jesus Christ. But so many times we run to the things we shouldn't be running to. Come on, somebody. We run to the things we shouldn't be running to instead of running to the things that God has called us to. It says, we'll come too, they said. So they went out in the boat, but they caught nothing all night. And I know for me that when I run back to things from my past to try to provide some momentary healing, they're not successful. And so where Peter used to be a great fisherman, he now catches nothing all night long. Verse 4, it says, at dawn, so right at the morning, the sun's coming up over the horizon. At dawn, Jesus was standing on the beach, but the disciples couldn't see who he was, maybe because the sun was in their eye. He called out, fellows, yo, fellas, have you caught any fish? No, they replied. Then he said, throw out your net on the right side of the boat, and you'll get some. So they did, and they couldn't haul in the net because there were so many fish. Now, maybe you're hearing that story and thinking, man, I've heard that story before. Pastor Tristan, you've preached on that story before. Well, this is actually the second time Jesus did this miracle. The first time was in Luke chapter 5. It was a totally different miracle. But the moment that he did it in Luke chapter 5, where they had been fishing all night, and Jesus walks up to Peter, he's mending his nets, he didn't catch anything, he tells Peter to go out and cast your net out again on the other side of the boat. Peter catches a big catch of fish. The first time Jesus did this miracle was the day that Jesus called Peter into ministry. And so in this broken moment, Jesus is recreating the experience for Peter. So Peter's in the boat having a deja vu moment. He's in the boat, hasn't caught nothing all night. Some stranger that he doesn't know yells out, throw the net over on the other side. He throws the net over, giant catch of fish, and Peter has deja vu. Jesus recreates this moment to let Peter know, hey, buddy, the relationship's still open. Like, I know you messed up, I know you screwed up, but the relationship is still here for you and I to be in connection with each other. Now, don't miss this. Jesus recreated the moment to say, come on, son. I love you. I want to be in relationship with you. The first time that Jesus did this miracle, Peter didn't know him. And it says that after Peter got all the fish in the boat, all his partners came to help, they got him to shore. Jesus comes up to Peter, and Peter says this in Luke chapter 5, verse 8. Peter tells Jesus, go away from me, Lord, for I'm a sinful man. So the first time Peter met Jesus, he felt condemned then. Now he's messed up. He's ran away from Jesus in relationship because he feels condemned again. But you know what's happened? Over the last 3 years, he got to know the character of Christ. And so in the boat, in this deja vu moment, I've got to believe that Peter remembers Jesus forgiving the woman caught in the act of adultery. That he remembers eating lunch at Zacchaeus' house. That he remembers Jesus telling the story of the prodigal son about how that no matter what you've done, the Father will accept you home with open arms. That he's remembering the thief that's crucified on the cross and Jesus saying to him, today you will be with me in paradise. And he's having this deja vu moment, but he doesn't respond the way he did the first time. He responds totally different because he understands the character of who Christ is. There's a total life change. And it says this, John 21 verse 7, John said to Peter, it's the Lord. And when Peter heard it was the Lord, here's his pivot moment. When he heard it's the Lord, he has this deja vu. He's heading in a wrong direction. He has this pivot moment. And it's in my heart that today, some of you do the same thing that Peter did. Look at what he does. It says, so he put on his tunic, for he had stripped for work. He didn't want to get his clothes dirty catching fish. He put on his tunic, and he jumped into the water, and he headed toward shore. He has a pivot point. He puts on his robe. He jumps out of the safety of the boat. He jumps out of the relationships that he isn't needing to rely on. He runs away from the fish that he just caught because this is not his provider. His provider's on the beach. And he begins to swim to shore because he understands when he gets there, there's a God who loves him, not a God who condemns him. He has a pivot point because he understood God's grace. The first time he said, Jesus, go away from me, for I'm an unholy man. This time, he swims to Jesus as fast as he can because he knows how good God is. Verse 8, it says this, the others stayed with the boat and pulled the loaded net to shore. And when they got there, they found breakfast waiting for them. The fish cooking over a charcoal fire and some bread. Now, come and have some breakfast, Jesus said. Then Jesus served them the bread and the fish. Now look at what happens. Look at what happens. Everybody right here. Jesus serves them. He doesn't rebuke him. He doesn't yell at him. He doesn't talk about, hey, Peter, remember that time that we were all in the courtyard and you in front of everybody yelled, I don't know the man? Remember that? Jesus doesn't bring up any of that. Instead, the Bible says that he cooks him breakfast. You know who you cook breakfast for? Someone you love. That's the only person that you would cook breakfast for is somebody that you are in relationship with. If your best friend denied you in front of some people, which led to the most excruciating pain in your life, and then you saw them 2 weeks later, you would not cook them breakfast. You would punch them in the mouth, right? That's what I would do. But you see, Jesus has more grace than we can understand. Jesus has more love for Peter than we can even understand. The grace and mercy of Jesus is life-changing. And Peter understood that so he could have a pivot moment to go back to Jesus. Lamentations tells us this. It says, the faithful love of God never ends. The faithful love of God never ends. His mercies never cease. It says, great is his faithfulness. His mercies begin afresh every morning. It doesn't matter how you have denied Jesus. Jesus doesn't deny you. He loves you, and he wants to be in relationship with you. Now, the preacher in me wants to just stop there. But the pastor in me has to tell you the rest of the story. Reading through all these encounters around Peter's life, something popped out to me that I never noticed before. All throughout the Bible, people are lighting fires to cook food. And I saw a detail that I never noticed before. It said that Jesus cooked them breakfast on a specific kind of fire, on a charcoal fire. Now, Jesus at the Sea of Galilee, there would have been a bunch of driftwood and vegetation that would have been easier for him to build a fire out of things that were around, but instead Jesus had to stop by 7-Eleven and buy some charcoal. He had to go somewhere and get something to bring it to the beach to light a charcoal fire. But why? Charcoal fires are only mentioned 2 times in the New Testament. The other time that it's mentioned is found early. We read it in John 18 when Peter is in the courtyard and he denies Jesus. Have you ever smelled a charcoal fire? You can smell it. And as Peter's swimming to shore, before he would have been able to embrace Jesus, he would have smelled the charcoal fire. You know, your sense of smell is one of your greatest senses that brings up memory and locations. And so Peter would have hit the beach and been hit by this smell from the charcoal fire, and he would have remembered his worst moment. He would have remembered this horrible moment that happened to him. He would have been flooded with emotion about how he stood warming himself by a charcoal fire, and now he hits the beach and smells a charcoal fire, and he would have remembered how he denied Jesus. Jesus recreated this moment so that for the rest of Peter's life, when he smelled charcoal, he wouldn't think of failure, but he would think of forgiveness. Because Jesus doesn't want to just forgive you, he wants to fix you. He wants to redeem all things for us. So that when there's a dark spot in your life, that when you drive by it or see it or think about it, and it makes you think about something that's failure associated, God redeems all things for us. And so Jesus lights a charcoal fire just to let Peter know, son, I love you. He didn't recreate this horrible moment to hurt Peter, but to heal Peter so his failure wouldn't haunt him. As I was praying for you today, I feel like some of you are here and you're haunted by a moment that you denied Jesus. That there was a time in your life that you did something, you said something, you made some decision, and in that decision you denied Jesus. And you're haunted by it. And today, Jesus is lighting a charcoal fire for you. To say, daughter, I don't care what you did. Son, I don't care what you did. I don't care if you pointed your finger at me and you yelled, I deny him. He says, I'm recreating some moments for you so you can be in relationship. You see, Jesus, he recreates these moments. He says, I love you. I want to fix the thing that hurt you. These two moments, he recreates the moment that Peter was called, and he recreates the moment that Peter messed up. You want to know why? It's because he's saying, I love you when you follow me, and I love you when you deny me. Peter, you left your nets and you followed me, and I loved you then. And then you broke my heart at this pivotal moment, but guess what? I love you anyways. And so no matter what happens in your life, God loves you. We sang a song earlier, it said, I will build my life upon your love. We don't build our life upon our accomplishments. We build our lives upon the love that Jesus has for us. John 21, verse 15, it goes on, it says, after breakfast, Jesus asked Peter, do you love me more than these? He's echoing back to the Last Supper. Yes, Lord, Peter replied. You know I love you. Then feed my lambs, Jesus told him. Jesus repeated the question, Peter, do you love me? Yes, Lord, Peter said. You know that I love you. Take care of my sheep, Jesus said. A third time, he asked the question, Peter, do you love me? And Peter was hurt that Jesus asked the question a third time. And he said, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Jesus said, then feed my sheep. Why did Jesus ask Peter this question 3 times? Because I believe he wanted to give him 3 opportunities to fix his 3 denials. I don't know him. I don't know him. I don't know him. Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? Yes, Lord. Yes, Lord. Yes, Lord. He gives Peter an opportunity to have a restoration so that when he hears the rooster crow, he doesn't think about his failure. When he smells the charcoal fire every morning in that society, he doesn't think about his failure, but he remembers the moment that Jesus came and forgave him. He's not shaming him because Jesus isn't pointing backwards. He's pointing forwards. He's saying, Peter, feed my sheep. Love my church. Preach the truth. He's pointing forward. We think that God looks back, but he doesn't. He looks forward into what he wants you to be. Would you stand with me this morning? So here's what I believe. I believe that it's summer. And I believe that what Pastor Whitney said is right. That in the summer, a lot of us, it's time to disengage. It's time to relax. But I believe that when life slows down, our faith should speed up.
Yeah, that's right.
And so this morning, I'm going to challenge you to have a pivot moment. And so for some of you, maybe you're here and you'd say, you know what, your pivot moment is that you need to jump out of the boat and you need to swim to Jesus. Peter didn't care about what the other disciples thought. He didn't care about what he had to leave behind to swim to Jesus. But he swam with everything that he could to be back in relationship. And I believe that some of you today need to run to Jesus and say, God, I want to be back in a relationship with you. But then I believe that there's some of you here that need to take a moment and re-smell the charcoal fire in your life from the past and redeem that thing. That you're thinking about the affair too much. You're thinking about the abortion too much. You're thinking about the addiction too much. And you're looking backwards. But Jesus is saying, I'm calling you to feed my sheep. I'm calling you to do great things. But you can't do that thing if you keep looking the wrong direction. And so I want to challenge the church to have a pivot moment. To not just stay in your seat, but to say, God, I'm ready to move. I'm ready to jump out of the boat and to swim your direction and to smell something new so that I can walk out free. So we're going to go into a time of worship. We're going to sing this song that says, I will build my life upon your love. Come on.